But sweetheart, it doesn't matter how much of our body we shatter, 'cause I've learned there's much less than 1% genetic difference between white and red, between red and white. And that thought keeps me awake at night, and that means Custer and I are 99% alike. And that means Custer and I are 99% alike.
Constance, would you mind offering a prayer for us today?
Creator, we come to you together in a time when we need more information and more harmony among ourselves. We are seeking to support the sovereignty of our Native nations and to understand better our heritage and to look for ways that we can be supportive of that, of our Native ancestors and our descendants in the futures to come, the next generations. We ask that we have a successful meeting tonight and hear what is to be presented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Constance. I'm sorry to catch you off guard like that, but I really appreciate seeing you. Constance is the treasurer of our organization on a council. Get my introductions. I want to introduce our speaker, but before we start that, I wanted to explain how this all came about. Many of you all realize that IIA and a number of other organizations have been involved with the writing of the American Indian Native Studies course that we are trying to get approved for the state of Texas for high schoolers. And in the process of writing that course, one of the topics that got brought up was blood quantum, citizenship, sovereignty, and all of these various things. And I will admit that when we were writing it, we stayed very focused on from 1492 to present in terms of the legality of, how our nations basically conducted government and governance of ourselves. And I got into a discussion somehow with Scott, and Scott says to me, now, Annette, the concept of blood quantum came way before there was any colonization of the Americas. And I'm like, what? So Scott's background, as I introduce him, you'll see why he has a component of knowledge that I do not have, and probably many of you all do not have on this call. But I think it's a helpful perspective, especially when we keep throwing out words like colonization, trying to indigenize things, understanding the pre-concepts of where we are today. So let me introduce Scott. Scott, if you can raise your hand, we'll put you on a speaker focus in a minute. But Scott recently retired from Texas Christian University. He was a full-time faculty member in the religion department. And for over almost 20 years. And he was the first Native American Nations and Community Liaison, which is really how I got to meet him. In 2012, he started working to bring Native perspectives and voices into the university setting. He created the course Understanding Religion, Society, and Culture, Native Americans, Christians, and American Ideals. And he taught that regularly until his retirement. Sorry. What was nice is the course explored Native American experiences with and the responses to Christianity, as well as European and American efforts to use Christianity to understand and dominate Native Americans and to dismantle their cultures. In 2015, he began helping organize broader Native American initiatives on campus and to build relationships with Native individuals, groups, and nations. In 2022, TCU was awarded him the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Award, which he greatly deserved for his work with Native American and Indigenous communities. And in 2023, the Texas TCU Race and Reconciliation Initiative made him a co-recipient of the Plume Award for his work in establishing and sustaining TCU's Native American and Indigenous Peoples initiatives. He is co-editing a forthcoming book with me and Theresa Gaul called Being in Relation, Indigenous Peoples, the Land, and Texas Christian University from 1873 to 2023. I don't think my daughter believes that I can write, so that may be a shock to her. He continues to work with another number of Native American communities and groups in Texas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska, including MMIW TX Rematriate, Indigenous Institute of the Americas, and he is active member at his ceremonial grounds, Muscogee Creek, located in Hanna, Oklahoma, which is quite an honor for someone to be brought into ceremonial stomp grounds. So I'm very proud and happy to have Scott with us. Our format today, he's got a PowerPoint. I'm going to ask him to, go forward with presentation, but then we'll reserve the end of the presentation for time for questions. And as he's talking, use the chat to write questions and thoughts that occur to you. And then I can collect those at the end. And if we don't cover everything, then we can definitely have Blood Quantum 2 as our next meeting to finish up and get more in depth into this conversation. So Scott, I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to put the view for speaker view and allow you to share.
All right. Thank you very much, Annette, for that very nice welcome. I appreciate that very much. I'm especially glad to see Dr. Amelia Gaston. I've been wanting to publicly put the doctor in front of her name, so this is the first time I've publicly called her Dr. Gaston. Congratulations, Amelia. Nice to see you there. I really am grateful for the opportunity to talk with you and to have a conversation, not a lecture, but a conversation where we can all learn more about blood quantum and its roots within Christianity. I have some, I call them session acknowledgments. They're not really land acknowledgments, but some about who I am, because many of you may not know me from anybody else, but I'm not Native American. I'm a white guy from Texas, and my family, all the different branches of it came, I think, primarily from England, but certainly other European countries, at least as early as the 18th century. They were not people of power. As far as I know, most of them were poor farmers, and they lived primarily in what we call the United States South. And then portions of my family first came to Texas in the 1850s, and over the next half century, I guess most of them got here, and that's how I got here. But I mention that just to point out that my family helped displace Native peoples, and they benefited from colonization, not because they were people of power. They weren't. They didn't have influence. They weren't wealthy people, but they took advantage of policies that were put in place by the United States government to help displace Native peoples. And as far as I know, in most of their experiences, Native peoples were first displaced, and then my family moved in along with many others. And I think that's an aspect of colonization that we overlook, is the average person's role in bringing that about. I'm a Texan, was born in Fort Worth, but raised in Conroe, which is used to be a long way away from Houston, but that's no longer true. But I also wanted to just point that out because my upbringing was in a very small conservative town in Southeast Texas during the 1960s and 1970s. And I held all the attitudes and beliefs that you might think a white guy growing up in that environment would hold. I don't say that proudly, but that's just the reality of it. Part of that was having very deep roots within fundamentalist evangelical Christianity, although I'm not a part of that anymore. But I have very deep roots in that. even to the point where um, I was, or I guess still am, technically an ordained Southern Baptist minister, although I don't practice that. I don't really see that as part of my identity there, but I do have that connection in with Christianity. And all of that's to say is that I have a lot to learn, and I probably have even more so to unlearn. And so I'm hopeful that tonight will be a continuation of that process. In terms of where I'm speaking from, this is North Texas. I'm in Weatherford, Texas, which is west of Fort Worth. And we know that Native peoples have been in what we now call North Texas for thousands of years. And this is especially the tribal homelands of the Wichita and affiliated tribes. But we also know many other tribes were in the area as well. It was not exclusive to the Wichita and affiliated tribes, but they have for hundreds of years seen this as part of their tribal homelands. And I always think it's important to mention and just keep in front of us that the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex was created on the basis of an exterminating war that the Republic of Texas was carrying out against Native peoples. And that goes back to May 24th, 1841, when General Edward H. Tarrant, assisted by Captain John B. Denton, and you'll recognize those names, attacked a series of Native settlements along what is called Village Creek, and shortly thereafter was called Caddo Creek. And I actually think that you can make the argument that Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex was built on missing and murdered Indigenous women, because the first casualty of that attack was an Indigenous woman, and another Indigenous woman and her child who was with her at the time were taken captive. I think that's a modern expression of missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I hope that we can think about those women and children and men that were involved in that attack, and remember them as we go through this session tonight. And then a couple of other things I just want to point out is, as we all know, blood quantum is extraordinarily complex. One of those complexities is that the very term blood itself is used differently and in different ways by people. At times, it refers literally to blood, but at other times, it's often used as a metaphor for many other things like culture and different ways of living. So that makes it complicated at times to know exactly how people or what they're thinking when they use the term blood. And we also have to keep in mind another complicating factor, and that is that prior to 1953, people did not talk about DNA and genetics, and they did not hold maybe the concepts that we understand blood and DNA to have today. So we have to be very careful about not reading back into what they have to say, modern concepts there. And I also understand, and you all know well, that blood quantum can be controversial. And as a non-native, I'm not trying to critique or evaluate the way Native communities are using them in the conversations that they are having with them about blood quantum. And at the same time, I'm also not intending to criticize Christianity as a faith and belief system. I don't mean to attack it in any way as a faith and a belief system. I have great respect for people of faith who are humble about their faith and sincere about their faith. But I am critical of Christian colonization. And I speak from the perspective of someone who has lived as a Christian colonizer and whose ancestors lived as a Christian colonizer. And as we go through the presentation, you'll see that I will have some things critical to say about that. So with that, let's jump into this and talk about the concept of blood purity, which is different from blood quantum. And this was especially prevalent in Spain and what they called New Spain here in the Americas. This was the idea that having pure blood meant that you did not have any ancestors who were Jewish or who were classified as heretics or later on who were Muslim. So for someone to make the claim that they possessed blood purity, they're saying none of their ancestors were Jews, heretics, or Muslims. And those people were categorized as old Christians. And that just simply meant they had a long lineage of ancestors who had been faithful to Christianity, and you did not have any of these taints or stains that would come from Jews, Muslims, or heretics. And there were a lot of benefits that came with having the category of being an old Christian. You were more likely to get certain governmental positions, religious positions, and so on. And in fact, to come to New Spain, if you were in Europe and you were part of the Spanish Empire, to come to New Spain, you had to be classified as an old Christian. Now, that doesn't mean that people who weren't old Christians didn't slip through. They did. But you had to prove your status as an old Christian before you were granted passage to New Spain. And they did try to enforce that quite vigorously. The idea that's laying behind this is the belief that Jewishness was transmitted through the blood, literally, and that there was a stain associated with Jews who were practicing Judaism, and that stain would be transmitted to you if you had a Jewish ancestor. And the same thinking was applied to those who were heretics, and later on, those who were Muslims, and then it even develops further there. But this was the thinking at the time, that I guess you could say your religiosity and the merits or demerits of it were transmitted to you through your ancestors, and you carried that with you, and it could rise up at any time. So if you had an ancestor that had been condemned as a heretic, there was a question mark over you, because they wouldn't have said it this way. Well, I was going to say because they carried the heretic gene, but that's interjecting modern knowledge back into the way they're thinking. But they would think that you carried the tendency to be a heretic, and that could come out, or to be Jewish, or to be Muslim there. And so, excuse me, my cat's already bored with my talk and she wants out. No, there she goes. Jewish or Muslim converts, if you had a Jewish or Muslim convert within the last 3 to 4 generations, then you would be classified as a new Christian. And it doesn't make any difference as to how devout you were to the Roman Catholic faith, which Spain was Roman Catholic. If you had one of these ancestors 3 to 4 generations back, you were going to have trouble securing some positions and even status in society. Now, later on, the concept of blood purity developed, and it started being associated with Spanish culture, Spanishness. But early on, it was purely rooted in Christianity. And of course, part of Spanish culture was the practice of Roman Catholicism. Now, when indigenous peoples entered the equation, because, Spaniards intermarried with indigenous peoples and had children. That began to stir things up some, because if you follow the logic, indigenous peoples from a Christian Roman Catholic perspective at the time would be considered idolaters because they were not worshiping the Christian God. And if you had ancestors that did that, then your blood was not pure. You were tainted. But they played, at least the crown and the papacy played a little loose with this, but because they sort of arbitrarily demarcated the time of what they called conquest. From that time on, if you had indigenous ancestors who converted to Christianity and remained faithful to Christianity, then you were okay. So it doesn't follow the logic all the way, but humans are not known for being consistent in the logic there. But I emphasize that was the sort of official understanding. The way people, everyday, ordinary people dealt with this was oftentimes very different. And it came to be that indigenous peoples were oftentimes considered to just be idolaters at heart and could never get on the rung there, although it was complicated for that. So here's kind of the idea behind this. It was believed that blood was the vehicle through which everything about you was transmitted. Your physical traits, your moral traits, religious traits, everything came through the blood. It was also believed that fathers had more of an impact on their children than mothers. And fathers were considered to be stronger, women were considered to be weaker. So if you start thinking about the implications of that, if you had a father who was indigenous and a mother who was Spanish, then that indigenous taint or stain could have a bigger impact on you than if it was the other way around. So that was another principle that was followed by this. And the belief was that the way parents were influencing what their children were to be came through the semen, the breast milk, the blood, and food. And food that the parents consumed would be turned into blood, and that would be then transmitted through semen and milk. So it was bigger than just what religion you practiced, but it can get down to what food you ate, influencing not only your physical traits, but also your moral traits, your personality traits, and everything else about you. And one other point about this thinking is that within the body, you had 4 liquids, or what they called humors: the blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. And the combination of those determined your makeup as a person in all ways: physically, mentally, emotionally. And it's interesting, part of medicine at the time would be that the idea that disease was created by an imbalance of the 4 humors. And so if you were sick, they might give you treatment to try to balance those, like, for instance, bloodletting. One of the ideas behind bloodletting is that maybe you had too much blood, and so you needed to release some of that in some way to bring that balance back. Now, I think it's important to remember Christianity did not create these ideas. These ideas go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. These are ancient ideas that were cutting edge ideas. This is what medicine at the time thought and believed about the body and reproduction and the relationship of the individual to their ancestry there. So Christianity did not create these ideas, but they certainly were using them. Remember, they didn't think in terms of DNA and genetics. They didn't have the privilege that we have of better understanding how we work physically. So they were operating out of the best knowledge that they had at the time. And you can see sort of the logic as to how the idea that, for instance, if you were Jewish and from a Christian perspective, Judaism was problematic, that's going to get passed to you if one of your parents or ancestors were Jewish. Now, that set up this kind of categorization in Spain and New Spain. And also other European countries held similar ideas, but they did different things with them. So they have the old Christians, which, as we've talked about, that would mean if you're categorized as such, and believe me, there was a huge ordeal that people had to go through to prove their lineage as old Christians. But if you got that category, it meant that you didn't have anything but devout Christians for many generations, as far back as you could get. If you fell under the category of new Christian, that usually referred to someone who had been practicing Judaism but had converted to Christianity, or Islam and had converted to Christianity. But those people had the stain, though. So there's a question mark over them because Judaism and Islam were considered to be idolatrous religions, and nonetheless, they carried those stains with them. But then you have where the whole issue gets very complicated is when Spaniards are intermarrying with people of Indigenous, Black, Jewish, Islam, Muslim, or any other descent. And so the idea was that if you had even one of these problematic categories in your ancestry, then just that one drop of blood could disqualify you, could make you questionable. And this is where the language, the terminology that arises, which we'll recognize today from blood quantum, but they would talk in terms of somebody being a half new Christian, quarter new Christian, quarter Jew, 1/16 new Christian, and you can imagine how far back that is. That's where that terminology is starting to arise, which I think blood quantum, picks up and carries it on in their own way. It's also important to remember the historical context behind blood purity. It originates really out of violence against Jews. Christianity, even though Christianity was birthed, excuse me, from Judaism, Jesus was Jewish. I always told my students that technically he was not a Christian because he practiced Judaism and Christianity was founded after his death. But despite this very close connection that Christianity has with Judaism, Christianity has had an anti-Semitic component to it since at least the end of the 1st century, the early 2nd century. And Christianity has a long history of violence against Jews, physical violence as well as other means of violence. During the 13th and 14th centuries, this violence was increasing, was rising to maybe not greater heights, but very high levels of intensity. And in this period, the pogroms, or the intentional attacking of Jewish people, were particularly violent during the late 14th century. This is exactly the time that blood purity is starting to arise. As you can imagine, there were a good number of Jews who converted to Christianity in order to survive the attacks. They were being attacked for their non-Christian beliefs. So one way to perhaps survive that is to convert to Christianity. But there was a lot of question around these Jewish converts to Christianity because of the idea of blood purity. In the minds of most people, they still carried the stain of Judaism, not only from their own practice, but from their ancestors' practice. And this is where the effort to create blood purity laws in Spain and New Spain were arising. It was out of this violence against Jews. This is also the time of the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was particularly focused on Jewish converts, even though many of them had been forced to convert to Christianity and were doing so out of survival strategies. It was thought that even the Jewish Christians might be corrupting, I guess you would say, the legitimate Christians, the old Christians. So the Spanish Inquisition put a close eye on them. And all of that's to say is that blood purity, it arises from anti-Semitism. Really 2 millennia, or by that time, a millennia and a half of anti-Semitism is where the idea of blood purity comes from. At the same time, you have the struggle with Islam continuing. Since the 700s, Muslim kingdoms had ruled most of where the modern nation of Spain had been located, that is the Iberian Peninsula. Christians had, for centuries, been attempting to expel Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. And so in the 1400s, when all of this is stirring in the air, you also have this struggle with Islam to dislodge them from the Iberian Peninsula, which then brings us to the year 1492. We all know that year. There was a lot happening in that year. In January, Spanish army, which was Christian, finally succeeded in expelling the last Muslim kingdom from the Iberian Peninsula. So that was a big deal in Christianity, to now be able to say that this land was ruled over by Christian rulers. In March of that year, Spain issued the Alhambra decree that gave Jews the option of either converting to Christianity within 4 months or they would be expelled from Spain. So this was a way to either force conversion, and if you're not willing to convert, then you're going to be expelled, even though Jews had lived in Spain for hundreds of years. July 30th, Spain followed through with the Alhambra decree, and those Jews who had not converted to Christianity, they were expelled from Spain. It's estimated around 200,000 Jews were forced to leave Spain. And then just a few days later, Columbus set off on his first voyage, and where he accidentally ran into the Bahamas because he didn't know they were there. And then colonization begins. So this is the broader, bigger context of blood purity. But we also have to remember, keep in mind, the ultimate goal of colonization is to take indigenous lands and resources. That's the whole reason why European countries and later on the United States were interested in this area. We hear there may have been individuals or small groups who came for different reasons. And we often hear in American history, it's all about freedom of religion. The bottom line, take the lands and resources. Christianity was central to that effort. And what I mean by that is it authorized the colonization of the lands. It inspired it, justified it, and actually carried it out. And this colonization, as we all know, was achieved through attempting to remove indigenous peoples from their lands. And you did that by one or two major ways. Either you kill them or you turn them into European Christians. You destroy their identities, their cultures, their communities. We call it today assimilation. So I think it's fair to say that colonization was Christianization, but colonization is ongoing today. So I include the notion that colonization is Christianization. Christianity played that central of a role in it. And this is where blood purity and later blood quantum becomes involved. We have to remember they are expressions of these bigger goals, and specifically to take indigenous lands and resources. And the way you do that is you destroy indigenous peoples as indigenous peoples, and you turn them in to European and later American Christians. And so the process is that first blood purity, later on blood quantum, is working to achieve the goal of the destruction of indigenous peoples in order to get land and resources. And just to give you an example of this, this is Pope Alexander VI, very famous papal declaration from 1493. That's the year after Columbus. It's an interesting document because the Pope writes to the King and Queen of Spain, and he says, I hear that Columbus has made some new discoveries, and he, in essence, gives to the King and Queen of Spain control and ownership of all of the Americas. Now, at the time, he had no idea that he was doing that because he didn't know what existed, but he basically turns it all over to them. But in exchange for that, as this quote shows, you'll notice that what he is saying to the King and Queen of Spain is the chief number one thing that you can do is to convert these people to Christianity. That's the number one thing. And he goes on to tell them, send good men, these are the missionaries, to do this conversion process. So conversion to Christianity is at the heart of colonization of indigenous peoples, and blood purity and blood quantum are some of the methods that are employed to make that conversion possible. And in doing that, you get the lands and resources. Now, that's an oversimplification, but that's kind of the bottom line of it. And in case I don't want to dogpile Roman Catholics, but Protestants were doing the same thing. This is the charter of the Virginia Company of London, and you can see right in the middle of it where the people who are issuing the charter are telling them, propagate the Christian religion. So blood quantum and blood purity become very important tools for Christians to assimilate Native Americans in their effort to gain those lands. The bottom line of this is that ultimately indigenous people could not exist as indigenous people within Spain. Here is just one of many examples where this Spanish official writes to the King and Queen of Spain, and he makes the argument from the biblical story of the conquest of the Promised Land, where the Israelites went to Canaan, which is where the modern states of Israel and Palestine are located today. And under God's orders, they take this land, and they are told by God to kill all of the Canaanites. Men, women, children, kill them all. This is in the book of Joshua, also the book of Deuteronomy in the Bible. But look at what this individual says in the last sentence. And all this was done by the will of God because they were idolaters. That word idolater is a very loaded and powerful word in the history of Christianity, but in the history of the colonization of the Americas. Because if you deem someone as being an idolater, then there's this long stream of Christianity that makes it permissible to kill them. And indigenous peoples were frequently targeted as idolaters who did not worship the true God. And in fact, among the Puritans, they often called indigenous peoples red Canaanites. And in the biblical story, if you're a Canaanite, that means you're an idolater and you're open to being killed. And this guy goes on to actually say to the king and queen of Spain that you're justified in demanding this land from native peoples because the Pope gave it to you. That was that papal declaration that we looked at earlier. And then he says, if they resist you, you can kill them. To be fair, however, there was a vigorous debate going on in Spain over the treatment of indigenous peoples. And Bartolomé de las Casas represents kind of the other side of this. He exposed a lot of the brutality that was going on, and he argued strongly on behalf of better treatment of native peoples. But as this quote from him indicates, he too believed that native peoples were to be ruled by Spain, converted to Christianity, and in essence become Spanish Christians. He was just saying we should be nice about it. Whereas the other guy was like, just kill them. Las Casas was, we should be more gentle about this. Now, what does this have to do with blood purity? And later on, blood quantum. Basically, it's the point that the option that native peoples are given in New Spain is to convert to Christianity. Once they do convert to Christianity, then they have to start the process of basically becoming Spanish Christians and leaving behind their indigenous identities. And it's Christianity that is causing this process to happen, this transformational process there. Initially, as we have seen, indigenous peoples were not considered to have this tainted blood because of that sort of arbitrary, once the conquering happens, they can then, if they're faithful to Christianity, they can get pure blood. But that changed. And the designation of being a pure Indian was this identity that was based on how faithful you and your ancestors had been, at least since the conquering in the late 14, early 1500s. But there were other factors that were involved in getting you that designation. So by the mid-1500s, they had developed a way to categorize society that's called the casta system. And it was primarily concerned with designating the amount of blood that you had from Spanish, indigenous, or African ancestors. They were also very concerned with which one of your ancestors were what. You know, were they Spaniard? Were they Black? Were they Indian? Not just the percentage of blood there. I'm going, for time's sake, I'm going to go by this because I want to get to this, to show you an example of what the casta system looked like. This is from the 1700s. And this is how a typical casta system was understood, that they would create usually 15 or 16 castes or levels of individuals, and they would measure you on the basis of your ancestry. So we'll look at the first three. If your parents were a Spaniard and an Indian, then you would be considered or classified as a mestizo. If you then, as a mestizo, married a Spaniard, and you two had a child, your child would be considered a castizo. And then if your child married a Spaniard, that child would be considered a Spaniard. So what do you notice going on here? Indigenous blood is taken away through the constant generational marriage of Native peoples with Spaniards. Now, if you bring in other mixtures, that creates other issues, which maybe we can talk about in the question and answer time. But notice there at the bottom, this quote that comes from this system where he says, finally, there are the heathen Indians. That's the non-Christian Indians. You don't even make it onto the list here unless you convert to Christianity. That's the gateway to get you into Spanish society. And then once you're into Spanish society, it's all about conversion to Christianity and removing everything indigenous about you. They often would make, in the 18th century, paintings that would portray the different caste. So on the left-hand side at the top is the portrayal of a Spaniard and an Indian who have the mestizo baby. Below that is the mestizo who marries the Spaniard and has a castizo. And then look on the right-hand side at the top, when the castizo marries a Spaniard, look, the baby's a Spaniard now. And compare that baby with the baby right across from it on the left-hand side. You can see the physical transformation that was believed to have taken place there. I'm going to go past these quotes as well. Here's another painting of the Costa system. This comes from the 1750s. This is very unusual because I believe it's the only one that has the Virgin of Guadalupe at the top. But I wanted to show you that the very first couple or family that you have at the top left, that's the Spaniard and Indian. But notice the Indian is portrayed in stereotypical Indian terms: bow and arrow, hardly dressed. But then by the time you get to the third family, you can see the Indian's removed. All of it's removed. This is blood purity. By the time of the late 19th, 20th century, this is where blood quantum picks up. And it is operating out of modern day notions of race. And this is where I think the connection comes with blood quantum, is that it grows out of, at least in part, from the notion of blood purity and the Christian notion of blood purity. So I think it's important to keep in mind, though, that Christianity and Christian notions of purity have had a longer impact on indigenous people than has the modern notion of race, which we're all familiar with. The modern notion of race did not arise until the 17th century. Christian notions of blood purity were in operation by the 15th century as applied to indigenous peoples, but long before that. And that what I think you see is that these ideas that the modern notion of race advances about non-white peoples were ideas and prejudices that Christianity had already put in place. So what was happening is these ideas were being taken out of a Christian environment and applied along racial lines in terms of modern ideas. Privileges that were given to Christians were transferred to white people. So these privileges of superiority, supremacy, those ideas, better positions in society that pure old Christians had you then see white people by the 19th, 20th centuries picking up on. And so I think it's important that when we have discussions today about race, that we should have the discussions that we're having, but they need to be balanced with the role that Christianity has played in the development of these ideas and these classifications there, and that Christianity be addressed at the same level. And then just other things, and I'll call it quits. Just to reemphasize, blood quantum is on a foundation of blood purity. And it is ultimately a Christian expression of who Native Americans are. This is something that this next point is very important. The history of anti-Semitism, especially in the United States, has been one where it's not a sustained violence against Jews, but it flares up at times when whether it's economic or political or other factors that cause it up, anti-Semitism flares up, so that Jews always live with the knowledge and the understanding that they are vulnerable at any moment for anti-Semitism to come against them. I think it's the same idea with blood purity as it's existing from a Christian perspective in American society. We may not see it being articulated constantly, but it is there. And when those who want to disempower Native Americans need it, they will pull on the language and the concepts and the ideas that grew from Christian blood purity, and they will use those to disempower Native peoples. So in that sense, I think blood purity is still with us. It's quite latent, but it's still with us. And then, of course, ultimately, blood purity and blood quantum is about the land. Because if you go back to what I said earlier, colonization and Christianization was about destroying Native peoples either through killing them or assimilation in order to get the land. Blood purity and blood quantum are tools in that process. And then finally, I would just leave it maybe on a little positive note. I think Christianity has the tools to create better relationships with Indigenous peoples. In Christian teachings and Christian practices and Christian influence, the possibility of more respectful, better relationships are there. But it's going to take a lot of work for Christianity to put those tools into action. Okay, so at that point, I'll call it quits.
Thank you so much, Scott. My goodness. We don't have any questions because it overwhelmed us.
Oh, sorry about that.
No. I'm processing it. Does anybody have some comments or questions without taking too much time? It's about 5 till 8. We can certainly go a little bit over that. People definitely want to have access to the recording, so we're going to send out the link for that. We'll put it on YouTube. We'll get it kind of edited up and everything. So I know I'm a little overwhelmed. I never learned this history at all. I shared with Scott, I don't even remember getting European history when I was in school. I really don't, other than World War histories, but none of the Christianity story that you're sharing with us today.
I think that today, the question of blood quantum and those that would like to force tribes to consider blood quantum before someone can be considered a member of that tribe has to do with reducing the power of Indigenous people in a political world, and has to do with voting and the rights that we have, the sovereignty rights. If they can control the number and reduce the number of people considered indigenous, that reduces the people they can consider as part of the constituency for Indian rights, Native rights.
Oh, I would just say, I think there are a lot of factors that impact blood quantum and how it's understood and how it's used. And I'm not qualified to speak on those. Tonight was just kind of a focus on the role that Christianity played in that. I do think a lot of times, especially in the United States, Christianity gets a pass on just how extensive its impact in the colonization of Native peoples has been. And I think, sort of to Annette's point, that most Christians do not know this history. And so most of the time when you talk about this history to them, they have no idea that their faith tradition has been that involved and has made the decisions that it made regarding Native peoples, which has primarily been violent.
One of the things that surprised us in working on the Ains course was one of the very first slave laws that was passed in Virginia. I think it was 1699. There was another in 1682 regarding Blacks for slavery. They included Native people, and it was based on blood quantum. So if you were full blood Native, then you were allowed to be a slave if you could prove you were half. So it was kind of the opposite situation. It was like the less Native you were, you know, the less tainted, is that the word they were using, Scott? The less tainted you were, the less right they had to enslave you. And this was, you know, this was Virginia. This was just one of the colonies, but that was an attitude that was there, was just this automatic decision that they had that right. You know, and that was one of the first laws that we saw. And that's actually where we thought the confusion, you know, of how we use blood quantum now as almost like a pride thing, right? But then how it was used so much against us back, you know, in the day, and now it's, you know, fits together a little better for me.
Well, Annette and I talked a little bit about this, but, you know, another complicating factor is how Native peoples and communities use the tools of colonization to turn against or to resist colonization. And blood quantum certainly falls into that category at some level.
Let me glance through some of the newer comments. Let's see if we have a lot of thank yous. We have some folks that are both Native and Jewish. That's, you know, to hear all of this is probably very powerful. Yeah, just a lot of compliments, Scott. I will share them with you later. I really appreciate everybody attending. This was a great group of people, and I feel like that maybe we could do a part 2 of some sort. Once we send out the video link, I would appreciate you all giving us some ideas on topics, either related to this or other topics. As you know, we have done Ask Uncle Gregory videos, and this is kind of a part of that talking time that we rarely get, to bring up subjects that are more complex and difficult and sometimes just fun. So if you all have any ideas of things you want IIA to find people for, or to go further with this discussion, we are always welcome to have that input. I want to thank you, Scott. This is a hard topic. You knew it well, though.
Well, thank you. I think Dora wanted to make a statement.
Dora, do you want to unmute?
Here, or it was I there? Okay, so I wanted to. It was more like a question, I think, because me being born Native. I'm from 3 different tribes, but I'm also Black. And so why it would have been so important for even my own people to discriminate against me, as far as like bleaching me out with turpentine and lard. I think I understand it as a way to try to protect me somewhat, but I'm not sure, because it was I was
Prejudice.
the prejudices they had against me, as far as singling me out, and feeding me in different areas and stuff like this. So I don't understand why that was, or why they would have done it.
You want to
Anybody?
address anything, Scott, that way?
Because even when I was taken in the scoop, when they found out I was Black, I was returned to my parents.
And Dora, a lot of that was the boarding schools were very founded in Christianity, correct?
Yeah, but that was before I was taken. That was before my mother was murdered.
Uh-huh.
So, because I was around 2.5 when they took me in the scoop, as well as 5 of my other family members, close relatives. They took us in the scoop. I was adopted out to a family in California, Phil and Carrie White. But then once they found out I was Black, then they returned me back to my parents. And that's where my father was Alabama Coshada and Black. And so that's where I get, my line to the Alabama Coshada. Mm-hmm.
And it's so confusing to think about how here we all were discriminated against and treated harshly and viewed
Yep.
in a very negative way. And then it's happening amongst each other.
Exactly.
We still see that today.
Exactly. Because
very painful.
Yeah, and it's boarding school teachings. And I always say that when we start judging, passing judgment on each other, criticizing, and going in with bad intentions, it's boarding school teachings. I see it all the time. And in my head, that's what I say. That's boarding school teachings.
And I think a lot of that, and it comes back to kind of how even Indigenous people used, in some sense, the blood quantums, because even in the Mexica people, there were certain people were considered nobles if they carried like a Toltec lineage, or if they carried like a stronger connection to the Chichimecas or something like that. It elevated you in that society, and this was even before any Europeans got here. And so it's just interesting to see how those still existed, and that was one of the things that kind of intrigued me that Dora told me that Scott had mentioned that the blood quantum in a sense existed before colonization.
Yeah.
And in terms of the nobles and the Mexica societies, Spaniards would intermarry with them as a way to enhance their credibility in Spanish culture. And it was usually those nobles who were declared as pure Indians, so that the Spaniards who intermarried with them would not run into problems of having intermarried a tainted or stained person.
Wow.
And then the nobles oftentimes would benefit from this higher status in Spanish society.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a girl to this very day who has a direct lineage to Moctezuma, and she's on a freaking reality TV show, and she looks like Betty Crocker or something. She's not looking native. So yeah, it's really interesting. I never knew about the castizo thing. I was talking about it with Dora. I never heard of that before.
Yeah.
So it is interesting.
We learned a lot from your event tonight, and I want to thank you so very much, because it's still so mind-boggling. I mean, I'm 73, and there's a lot I still try to figure out. And one of my main things is I want to to be part of ending within my life, my family, the Indian boarding school teachings. I think it's, for myself, it's to get away from that, to be placing judgment on people, you know.
Because I think it feels like what happens, and just from my own perspective of like being into, because I grew up in California, I grew up around, I was always going to the powwows. I always notice how like it's like the different nations, so there's little subtle shades that's thrown. It's like, oh, the Cherokee, they're all, you know, diluted or this or that. And it's like, it's just a constant shade when it's like, it almost weakens the community in some ways.
We need
And
to come
it's like, we all
together.
need to be together.
Yeah.
And it's so hard because like some people just don't want to do the conflict resolution stuff. And even sometimes, like Dora was just telling me how one time somebody said, oh, you're Lakota, you're this.
Yeah.
And it's like, excuse me? Like,
One of the radicals.
you
And I'm
know,
like,
and
what
it's
is
just
that?
kind of like so many people are painted with a broad brush. And it's like, how can we unravel those teachings within our people to find, because it's like even the Mexicas and the Purépechas would have never been destroyed had there not been that rivalry, you know. And I'm seeing those rivalries emerge once again, just like the subtle shade, and the shade as in like just the subtle prejudices and judgments. And it's like those by this point, it's 2024. It's like, how can we move on past those things and start the healing process? Because it's like Dora always tells me, it's going to take another 7 generations for us to heal from all of that.
But it's events like this and discussions and talks and sharing of information that helps us to learn. Even myself at 73, I've learned a lot tonight. So I want to thank you, because for me, knowledge is power. So I'm very grateful for that. And with my son also learning here.
Thank you so
Welcome
much.
back, son. Welcome back from your family. Yeah. All right. Well,
okay.
I want to thank everybody again. And it's 10 after 8, and we've used everyone's time quite a bit, but be watching for either a part 2 or another topic that you throw out to us. We'll make this happen. These conversations are probably the thing that's going to help get things better. We have to know one another one-on-one and as groups, and you know, be more compassionate about this history and not fall into the trap again. Scott, thank you again. It was marvelous.
Thank you.
All right. Goodbye, everybody. Have safe journeys into your bed. Hopefully you're at home. Good night.
I have no Indian name. No, I have no Indian name. Is the rainbow just a color, or the blood inside my veins? I have no Indian name. I have no Indian name. My tears smoke the fire as I stand inside the rain. Hey,